I didn't pull the trigger, but my fingers killed 300 men. My name is Thomas Ellis, and in the summer of 1942, I was a 23-year-old telegraph operator aboard HMS Blackwood, a corvette assigned to escort Convoy PQ-17 through the Arctic Circle to Murmansk. I wasn't a sailor by birth. I was a bank clerk from Leeds who'd volunteered after my younger brother was killed at Dunkirk. I thought I was signing up to fight Nazis. Instead, I was given a headset, a code book, and a chair in a cramped radio room that smelled of sweat, oil, and fear. And on July 4th, 1942, I made a mistake that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The Arctic was unlike anything I'd imagined. Not just cold, though the wind cut through your bones like a blade, but empty. Endless grey sea, endless grey sky, silence so deep it pressed against your eardrums. We were 35 merchant ships and 6 escorts carrying tanks, planes and ammunition for Stalin's army. Every man on that convoy knew we were sailing into a trap. The Germans called it the coffin route. And they were right. For days we heard whispers over the radio. U-boat sightings, Luftwaffe patrols, encrypted chatter from the Tirpitz, the monster battleship lurking in a Norwegian fjord. Tension built like ice on the rails. Then, on the morning of July the 4th, the order came from the Admiralty in London. Convoy PQ-17, disperse immediately, escorts to withdraw west at best speed. The message was clear, brutal but clear. The Tirpitz was coming. If we stayed together, we'd be annihilated. So we scattered, 35 lone ships, defenseless, drifting into the void. But here's what no history book mentions. The second message. 23 minutes after the dispersal order, another transmission crackled through my headphones, this one from the First Sea Lord's office, marked Urgent, Amend Previous. It read, Recall dispersal, reform convoy, escorts to resume positions, threat assessment revised. I stared at the paper in my hands. My fingers trembled. The first message had already been passed to the captain. The escorts were already turning away, and now this, contradictory, frantic, possibly sent in error. I knew the protocols. In cases of conflicting orders, you verify. But verification took time, and in the Arctic, time was measured in U-boat torpedoes. I made a choice. I didn't pass the second message. I told myself it was a mistake, a garbled transmission, a clerical error in London. I told myself the first order was the real one, but the truth. I was afraid that if I contradicted the captain, if I caused confusion in the middle of chaos, I'd be blamed for whatever happened next. So I folded the paper, tucked it into my logbook, and said nothing. Within hours, the slaughter began. German bombers found the merchant ships alone, drifting like wounded animals. U-boats circled like sharks. One by one, the ships went down, the Carlton, the Paulus Potter, the Navarino, each taking dozens of men into the freezing water. There was no rescue, no hope, just smoke, screams over the radio, and silence. By the time it was over, 24 ships were lost, over 150 merchant sailors and naval personnel dead. And I had held the message that might have saved them. I never told anyone, not my captain, not my crewmates. Not even my wife, years later, when we sat by the fire in our cottage in Cornwall. I buried the logbook in a tin box under the floorboards of our shed and tried to forget. But you cannot forget the sound of a man's voice breaking as his ship sinks beneath him. You can't forget the static that follows. After the war, I read the official reports. They blamed the Admiralty. They called it a tragic miscalculation. No one mentioned a second message. No one knew. And I let them believe it. For 50 years, I lived a quiet life. I taught mathematics at a grammar school. I raised 2 daughters. I tended my garden. On the surface, I was ordinary. But inside, I carried the weight of those 300 lives. Not because I sank their ships, but because I chose silence when I should have spoken. People say war is about courage. But sometimes it's about the moments when courage fails you, and you live with that failure longer than the war itself. In 1992, a historian contacted me. He'd found fragments of decoded German signals, suggesting the Tirpitz never actually left port that day. The threat had been overestimated. The dispersal order, the one I obeyed, was based on fear, not fact. And the second message, it was real, verified, sent too late, but real. That night, I dug up the tin box. The paper was yellowed, brittle, but the words were still clear. I held it in my hands and wept, not for myself, but for the men who died because I was too afraid to say, "Wait, there's more." I never published my account. I never gave interviews. But now, at 93, I'm telling it. Not for absolution, I don't deserve that, but so someone will know the truth. Sometimes, the deadliest weapon in war isn't a torpedo or a bomb. It's a message left unsent. And I sent none. I only kept silent. But silence, I've learned, echoes louder than any explosion. I remember the morning of July 3rd with unnatural clarity, the last calm before the storm. The sea was glassy, the sky a pale wash of blue, almost peaceful. Captain Reeves stood on the bridge, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon as if he could will the Tirpitz out of existence. Below deck, I was decoding routine weather reports when the first real warning came through. U-boat Wolfpack assembling north of Bear Island. I passed it up immediately. The captain's face didn't change, but his knuckles whitened on the railing. We all knew what it meant. The noose was tightening. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the radio room, listening to the hum of the engines and the distant crackle of other ships checking in. Each voice was a thread in a fragile web, and I was the keeper of those threads. If one snapped, I'd hear it first. The responsibility pressed on me like the weight of the ocean above. At 09:17 on July 4th, the Admiralty's first message arrived. I decoded it in under a minute. My hands were steady, but my stomach turned to ice. Disperse immediately. I took it to the bridge myself. Captain Reeves read it twice, then nodded grimly. Signal all escorts. We withdraw in 10 minutes. I returned to my station and began tapping out the order, each click of the key feeling like a nail in a coffin. Then at 09:40, the second message came. Short, urgent, contradictory. My blood ran cold. I read it 3 times, hoping the words would change. They didn't. I looked at the clock. The escorts were already turning. If I sent this now, it would cause chaos. Ships changing course mid-maneuver, captains shouting over radios, confusion in the face of the enemy. I thought of my brother at Dunkirk, how he'd written that the worst moments weren't tea under fire, but in the silence before, when you knew something was wrong but didn't know what to do. So I did nothing. I told myself it was protocol. I told myself London had panicked. I told myself I was protecting the convoy from further confusion, but deep down I knew I was protecting myself from blame, from doubt, from the terrifying possibility that I might be wrong. By noon, the first distress call came through. This is SS River Afton, we're under air attack, position, then static, then another and another. I sat there, headphones clamped to my ears, listening to men die, knowing I held the words that might have kept them alive. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just kept listening, as if by bearing witness I could somehow undo what I'd done. When we returned to Scapa Flow 2 weeks later, the mood was funereal. 24 ships gone, hundreds of men lost. The official inquiry began almost immediately. I was questioned briefly. Routine, they said. I showed them my logbook, carefully edited to omit the second message. They thanked me and moved on. No one suspected. Why would they? I was just a boy with a headset, not a decision maker, but I was. In that moment, I was the only one who knew both truths, and I chose the easier one. For decades, I told myself it wouldn't have mattered, that the Tirpitz was real, that the convoy was doomed anyway. But the historian's letter in 1992 shattered that lie. The Tirpitz never sailed. The threat was a phantom. And the second message? It was London correcting its own panic. If I'd sent it, the convoy might have held together. The escorts might have stayed, Lives might have been saved. I am 93 years old now. My hands shake. My eyes grow dim. But my memory is sharp, too sharp. I still hear those voices. I still see that paper in my hands. And I still ask myself every night, what if I'd spoken? I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I hope that by telling this, someone will understand. The quietest choices can echo the loudest. And sometimes the heaviest burden isn't what you did, but what you didn't say. We returned to Scapa Flow on July 27th, 1942, under a sky so grey it felt like morning. HMS Blackwood limped into harbour, with her hull scarred by ice, and her crew hollow-eyed from sleepless nights and unspeakable guilt. No one cheered, no band played. The dock workers didn't look at us. They looked through us, as if we were already ghosts, and in a way we were. We'd left 35 ships behind, and though only 6 of us had turned away, we all carried the weight of the 24 that never made it home. I spent the first week ashore in a daze. I slept in a barracks with other radio operators, but I didn't speak. I ate when food was placed in front of me. I answered questions with nods or monosyllables. My superiors assumed I was shell-shocked, common, enough after Arctic duty, and assigned me to light clerical work in the signals office. No radios, no codes, just filing, copying, the quiet hum of bureaucracy, trying to pretend the ocean hadn't just swallowed 153 men whole. But the silence inside me wasn't shock. It was calculation. Every time I passed a notice board with casualty, lists, every time I heard a sailor mention PQ-17 in a hushed tone, I braced myself for the moment someone would ask, "What did you hear on the radio that day?" But no one did. The Admiralty had already framed the narrative, a tragic but necessary dispersal order based on credible intelligence. The blame was diffuse, institutional, safely buried in Whitehall memos, and I let it stay buried. Then came the letters. Not official ones. Those stopped after the inquiry. These were personal. A widow from Glasgow wrote to the ship's address, asking if anyone had seen her husband, a steward on the Troubadour, in the water. A mother from Hull sent a photograph of her son, 19 years old, smiling in his merchant navy cap, and asked if he'd suffered. I read them all in the privacy of the signals office after hours, my hands trembling, my throat tight. I wanted to write back, to say, I heard his ship go down, I heard him call for help. But what good would that do? It would only confirm their worst fears and expose my silence. So I filed the letters away, unread by anyone else, and told myself it was kindness. But it wasn't. It was cowardice dressed as compassion. In September, I was reassigned, not to another ship, but to a training school in Portsmouth, teaching new recruits how to decode signals. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was teaching boys how to listen, while I myself had failed to speak when it mattered most. I stood at the front of the classroom, pointing to cipher wheels and frequency charts, and wondered how many of them would one day face a choice like mine. Would they hesitate? Would they stay silent? Or would they find the courage I lacked? I met Eleanor in Portsmouth that winter. She worked in the naval canteen, warm, practical, with a laugh that cut through the gloom like sunlight. She didn't ask about PQ-17. She didn't ask about the Arctic. She asked if I liked tea with milk, if I'd ever seen the sea from Beachy Head, if I believed in second chances. I said yes to all 3. We married in June 1943 in a small church with rain tapping on the stained glass. As I slipped the ring on her finger, I promised to be honest with her always. It was the one promise I knew I'd break. After the war, we moved to Cornwall, to a cottage with a view of the sea, though never the Arctic, never that sea. I took a job teaching mathematics at a grammar school. Numbers were safe. They didn't lie. They didn't scream over radios. They simply were. I threw myself into lesson plans and cricket matches and parent-teacher conferences, building a life so ordinary it felt like armor. Our daughters, Margaret and Helen, grew up thinking their father was quiet, perhaps a little distant but kind. They never knew about the logbook hidden under the shed floorboards. They never heard the ghosts in my sleep. For years, I told myself the truth didn't matter anymore. The war was over. The dead were buried. The world had moved on. But the past has a way of circling back, especially when you've left a door open. It happened in 1958. I was reading the Times over breakfast when I saw a review of a new book, Convoy to Oblivion, The Tragedy of PQ-17. My heart stopped. I bought the book that afternoon and read it in one sitting. The author, a retired naval historian, laid out the sequence of events with chilling clarity. The First Order, the panic in London, the withdrawal of escorts. But then, on page 142, he wrote, "Some survivors later claimed a second contradictory message was received but never acted upon. No evidence has been found to support this." I closed the book and sat in the dark for hours. He was right. There was no evidence. Because I'd destroyed it, not the logbook that was still hidden, but the truth. I'd let the official story stand, unchallenged, for 16 years. And in doing so, I'd erased the one thing that might have brought clarity to the families. The knowledge that the order wasn't just tragic, it was reversible. And someone had chosen not to reverse it. I almost burned the logbook that night, but I couldn't. It was the only proof that I'd been there, that I'd known, that I'd failed. Destroying it would have been another act of erasure. So I left it where it was, wrapped in oilcloth beneath the floorboards, next to a rusted tin of Eleanor's old sewing needles. Time passed. The girls grew up. Eleanor died in 1987, peacefully in her sleep, holding my hand. At her funeral, Margaret said, "Dad, you've carried so much alone." I didn't correct her. I just nodded because it was true, though not for the reasons she thought. Then in 1992, the letter arrived. It was from Dr. Alan Mercer, a historian at King's College London, working on a revised account of PQ-17 using newly declassified German naval archives. He wrote that intercepted Luftwaffe signals confirmed the Tirpitz never left Alta Fjord on July 4th. More importantly, he'd found a reference in an Admiralty clerk's diary to a second signal, urgent, possibly misrouted. He was trying to locate anyone who might have received it. My hands shook as I read it. For the first time in 50 years, someone was looking for the truth I'd buried. I didn't reply for weeks. I walked the cliffs, watched the gulls wheel over the waves, and asked myself, what now? If I spoke, I'd shatter the life I'd built. My daughters would see me not as their quiet father, but as a man who let hundreds die to save his own skin. But if I stayed silent, the record would remain incomplete. The families would never know the full story, and the ghosts would keep whispering. One rainy afternoon, I went to the shed. I pried up the loose floorboard, pulled out the tin box, and opened it. The logbook was there, the pages brittle but intact, and tucked inside the carbon copy of the second message, faded but legible. Recall dispersal, reform convoy, threat assessment revised. I sat on the damp earth and read it again, just as I had in 1942. But this time, I didn't fold it, I didn't hide it. I held it in my hands and wept for the men who died, for the families who grieved in ignorance, for the boy I'd been who didn't know that silence could be its own kind of violence. I wrote back to Dr. Mercer the next day. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough to point him in the right direction. I told him I'd been aboard Blackwood, that I remembered confusion in the radio room, that some messages may not have reached the bridge. It was vague, it was safe, but it was a start. He wrote back within a week, grateful, intrigued. He asked for more details. I hesitated. Then I realized this wasn't about me anymore. It was about them, the men in the water, the voices, in the static, the names on the memorials with no story behind them. So I began to write, not for publication, not for fame, but for witness. Page after page I described the Arctic sky, the weight of the headset, the terror in that moment of choice. I didn't excuse myself. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I simply told what happened. And as I wrote, something shifted. The ghosts didn't disappear, but they grew quieter, not because I'd redeemed myself, but because I'd finally stopped running from them, because the truth, I've learned, isn't a weapon. It's a lifeline. And sometimes it's the only thing that can pull you back from the depths. I sent my first letter to Dr. Alan Mercer on a Tuesday in March 1993, sealed in an envelope with a Cornish postmark and a return address that felt like a lie. I didn't sign it Thomas Ellis, former telegraph operator. I signed it simply T.E., as if even my name were too heavy to bear. In it, I described the radio room aboard Blackwood, the static-laced transmissions, the panic in London's voice over the secure line. I mentioned the second message, but only as a rumor, a possibility, something heard but never confirmed. I told myself I was being cautious, but the truth was, I was still hiding. Mercer wrote back within 10 days. His letter was polite, scholarly, but urgent. He'd cross-referenced my account with Admiralty logs and found a gap, a 23-minute window on July 4th, where no outgoing signals from Blackwood were recorded. "This aligns with your recollection," he wrote. If a second message was received but not relayed, it would explain why the convoy dispersed irrevocably. He asked if I'd be willing to speak in person. "Your testimony could bring closure to dozens of families," he added. "And perhaps to yourself." I didn't answer for 3 weeks. Instead, I walked the cliffs every morning, watching the sea churn below, wondering if the men of PQ-17 had seen the same horizon in their final moments. I thought about Margaret and Helen, now women with children of their own, who still called me every Sunday, who still believed their father was a quiet, decent man who'd done his duty. What would they think if they knew I'd held a lifeline in my hands and let it slip? One evening, Helen came to visit with her son, Jamie, then 8 years old. Over tea, Jamie asked, "Grandad, were you a hero in the war?" I froze. Helen shot me a look, half amused, half protective, and said, "Your granddad kept the radios working. That's how ships talk to each other." Jamie nodded solemnly. "So you helped them not get lost?" "Yes," I said. I helped them not get lost. The lie tasted like ash. That night I sat at my desk and wrote Mercer a second letter. This time I didn't hide behind initials. I signed my full name. And this time I told the truth. I received the second message. I decoded it. I chose not to pass it on. I didn't explain why, not yet. But I named the time, the frequency, the exact wording. I included a sketch of the logbook page, with the entry deliberately omitted. "The original is in my possession," I wrote. "I will bring it to you if you still wish to meet." He replied by telegram, "Come to London, King's College. Room 314, Thursday, 10 a.m. I booked a train ticket the next day. I didn't tell my daughters. I told them I was attending a Veterans Archive meeting. Not entirely false, but not true either. As the train pulled out of Penzance Station, I clutched the tin box in my lap, the logbook inside like a confession waiting to be heard. Mercer was younger than I expected, mid-50s, silver-haired but energetic, with eyes that missed nothing. He shook my hand firmly, led me to a quiet office lined with books on naval history, and offered me tea. No judgment, no pressure, just quiet respect. When I placed the logbook on his desk, he didn't open it immediately. He looked at me and said, "This must have cost you." I nodded. 50 years. He read the missing entry in silence. Then he turned to his typewriter and began transcribing it, his fingers moving with the precision of a man who understood that words could be evidence, memorial, and reckoning all at once. When he finished, he handed me a copy. "This will go into the official addendum to the PQ-17 inquiry," he said. "With your permission," I hesitated. "Will my name be attached?" "Only if you agree. Otherwise, it will be anonymous source, HMS Blackwood." I thought of Jamie's question. "Were you a hero?" I wasn't, But maybe I could be honest. Use my name, I said. That decision changed everything. 2 months later, Mercer published a short article in the Naval Review. New evidence in the PQ-17 tragedy, a telegraph operator's confession. It didn't sensationalize. It didn't condemn. It simply presented the facts. A second message existed. It was received. It was not relayed. And for the first time, the record acknowledged that the disaster wasn't just a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of nerve. The response was immediate. Letters arrived from descendants of lost sailors, some angry, some grateful, most simply relieved to finally have a clearer picture of what happened to their fathers, grandfathers, uncles. One woman wrote, "My grandfather's ship went down alone," knowing he wasn't abandoned by command, but by a single moment of human fear, makes his death feel less cruel. Her words stayed with me for weeks. But the hardest moment came when Margaret called, "Dad," she said, her voice tight. "Helen showed me the article. Is it true?" I didn't lie. "Yes." There was a long silence. Then softly, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because I was ashamed," I said. "And because I thought silence would protect you from that shame. You don't have to carry it alone," she replied. And just like that, the dam broke. I told her everything, the fear, the guilt, the decades of quiet torment. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You were 23, Dad. You made a mistake in hellish circumstances. That doesn't make you a monster. It makes you human." Helen came to Cornwall the next weekend. She brought Jamie. Over dinner, she asked me to tell them about the Arctic, not the mistake, but the men. So I did. I spoke of the steward who sang sea shanties to calm the crew, of the young radio operator on the Navarino who'd just become a father, of the way the northern lights sometimes danced above the convoy like a blessing. Jamie listened, wide-eyed. "They were brave," he said. "Yes," I said. "They were." In the months that followed, I began speaking, not publicly, but privately. I met with 3 families of lost sailors. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I simply listened to their stories and shared what I could. One widow held my hand and said, "Thank you for not letting them be forgotten." I wept then, not for myself, but for the decades of silence that had kept their grief incomplete. Mercer invited me to a small symposium at King's College in 1995. I stood before a room of historians, veterans and descendants, and read a short statement. I failed those men, but I will not fail their memory again. No one applauded. They simply nodded. And in that nod, I found something I hadn't known I needed: witness. I am 93 years old now. My body is frail, but my mind is clear. I still walk the cliffs. I still hear the sea. But the ghosts are quieter now. Not gone, but acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, there is a kind of peace, because the truth doesn't erase the past, but it can give it meaning. And sometimes, that's enough. I never thought I'd return to the Arctic, not in body anyway. For 50 years, I'd revisited it only in dreams. Endless grey sea, the crackle of static, the voices calling into the void. But in the summer of 1996, at the age of 94, I found myself on a flight to Moscow, then a train to Arkhangelsk, clutching a worn copy of the PQ-17 casualty list and a letter from Dr. Mercer. "They've built a memorial. They want you there." The invitation had come from the Russian Ministry of Defense in cooperation with the Arctic Convoy Veterans Association. They were unveiling a new monument to the Allied sailors who died delivering aid to the Soviet Union during the darkest days of the war. Over 3,000 names would be inscribed. British, American, Dutch, Panamanian, the men of PQ-17 among them. And because my testimony had helped clarify the final hours of so many ships, they asked if I would attend. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a witness. Margaret insisted on coming with me. "You shouldn't go alone," she said. And she was right. My hands shook too much to manage luggage. My breath grew short on stairs. But more than that, I needed someone who knew the truth to stand beside me when I faced those names. Arkhangelsk in July is a place of pale light and quiet rivers. The air smells of pine and salt, and the northern Divina flows wide and calm toward the White Sea, the same waters that once swallowed 24 merchant ships whole. We stayed in a modest hotel near the port, where old sailors still gather in the evenings to drink tea and speak of ice, U-boats, and the strange courage of foreigners who came to help. The memorial stood on a bluff overlooking the river, a curved wall of grey granite, etched with thousands of names in Cyrillic and Latin script. As we approached, I slowed my steps. My heart pounded not from exertion but from dread. What right did I have to stand here? I hadn't died for this cause. I hadn't even spoken for it until it was far too late. Margaret took my arm. "You're here to remember them," she said softly. "Not to punish yourself. The ceremony was simple. A Russian admiral spoke of sacrifice and alliance. A British naval attaché read a poem by a sailor who'd survived PQ-17. Then, one by one, veterans and descendants stepped forward to lay flowers. When my name was called, Thomas Ellis, telegraph operator, HMS Blackwood, the crowd fell silent. I didn't know if they knew my story. But they knew I was there, and that was enough. I walked to the wall with Margaret's support, my eyes scanning the names. Their SS Carlton, 35 lost. Their SS Paulus Potter, 37 lost. Their SS Navarino, 42 lost. I stopped at SS Troubadour. The widow from Glasgow had written to me in 1942. Her husband's name was James MacLeod. I found it, J. MacLeod, steward, and placed my hand on the cold stone. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I heard you." I just didn't speak. Tears came then, not in a flood but in quiet streams. Not for myself, but for all the voices I'd silenced by my own silence. For 50 years, I'd carried the weight of those deaths as a private burden. But here, carved in stone, they were no longer mine to hold alone. They belonged to history, to families, to this place. After the ceremony, a man approached me, tall, silver-haired, with eyes that held the same weariness I saw in my own mirror. He introduced himself as Captain Yuri Petrov, retired Soviet Navy. "My father was on a minesweeper that escorted PQ-18, he said in careful English. He spoke of PQ-17 often. He said the sea was full of ghosts that winter. He paused, then added, "Thank you for telling the truth. It honors them." We sat on a bench overlooking the river, and he told me stories I'd never heard, how Soviet dock workers wept when they saw the first Allied ships arrive, how children in Murmansk were taught to say thank you in English, how the tanks and planes from those convoys helped turn the tide at Stalingrad. "You did not just send supplies," he said. "You sent hope." I had never thought of it that way. To me, PQ-17 was a failure, but to him, it was part of a chain of courage that saved his country. And in that moment, I began to see my own role not as a single act of cowardice, but as one thread in a vast, flawed human tapestry. That evening, Margaret and I walked along the riverbank. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the water. "Do you feel different?" she asked. "Not lighter," I said, "but less alone." The truth hadn't erased what I'd done, but it had connected me to something larger than my guilt. These men hadn't died for a perfect plan. They died for an imperfect cause. Freedom, yes, but also the stubborn belief that one nation shouldn't face darkness alone. And in that, even my silence had a place. Not as justification, but as a reminder that war is not fought by heroes, but by humans. The next morning before we left, I returned to the memorial alone. I brought a small brass plaque I had made in Cornwall, in memory of the 153 souls of Convoy PQ-17. Their voices were heard. Their names are remembered. I didn't sign it. It wasn't about me. I pressed it into the earth at the base of the wall, where rain and time would slowly wear it smooth. On the flight home, I slept for the first time in weeks without dreaming of static or sinking ships. Not because the past was gone, but because I'd finally faced it in the place where it belonged, among the names, the stones, the living memory of those who refused to let sacrifice be forgotten. Back in Cornwall, I began writing again, not just for historians, but for schools. I sent letters to teachers offering to speak via phone, my voice still steady, about the human cost of war, the weight of communication, the danger of silence. A school in Leeds even named their history. Prize after PQ-17. I cried when they told me, I will never undo what I did on July 4th, 1942, but I've learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about ensuring it serves the future. Every time a student reads about PQ-17 and understands that decisions are made not by machines, but by trembling hands and fearful hearts, my silence loses a little more of its power, and that, perhaps, is the only peace a man like me can earn, because the sea forgets nothing but memory. True, shared, honest memory can heal even the deepest wounds. And on that granite wall in Arkhangelsk, their names are no longer lost. They are home. I'm 95 years old now, and my body is failing. My hands tremble too much to hold a pen for long. My breath comes in shallow waves, like the tide receding from a shore it will never touch again. But my mind, blessedly, painfully, is clear. And so, with Margaret's help, I've set up a small tape recorder on my desk, the same kind the BBC used in the 1950s. I've asked Jamie to come this weekend. He's 22 now, studying history at university, and he's asked me to tell him the full story. Not the article, not the memorial speech, but the truth as I lived it. So this recording is for him, not for historians, not for the record. For Jamie, I want him to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to speak despite it. And I want him to know that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, is not the same as peace. I begin with the Arctic, not the disaster but the quiet before. The way the sea looked like liquid lead under a sky that never fully darkened. The sound of ice groaning against the hull. The way we'd gather in the mess after watch, sharing tins of condensed milk and stories of home, as if words could build a bridge back to normalcy. I want him to know these men weren't just names on a wall. They were fathers who missed their children's first steps, brothers who promised to write, young men who'd never kissed a girl. And I failed them not with malice, but with a single frozen moment of self-preservation. But I also want him to know this. I spent 50 years believing I didn't deserve forgiveness. And maybe I don't, but I've learned that forgiveness isn't always about being absolved. Sometimes it's about being seen. When Margaret held my hand and said, "You are 23, she didn't excuse me. She humanized me. And in that humanity, there was room for both guilt and grace. Jamie arrives on a Friday afternoon, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes bright with the curiosity of youth. He doesn't ask for drama. He asks for truth. "Grandad," he says, sitting beside me, "why did you wait so long to speak?" I look at him, really look, and see not just my grandson, but the future I helped protect by finally breaking my silence. "Because I was afraid the truth would make me a monster," I say. "But silence made me a ghost. And ghosts can't love, can't teach, can't hold their grandchildren's hands." He nods, and in that nod, I see understanding, not judgment, not pity, but the quiet recognition that people are more than their worst moments. That evening, we sit by the fire, and I play him the recording I made for Dr. Mercer, the raw, unedited version, with all my stumbles and silences. He listens without interrupting. When it ends, he says, "You could have lived your whole life without telling anyone. But you didn't. That's not weakness, Grandad. That's courage." I don't correct him. Maybe he's right. Maybe courage isn't just in the moment of action, but in the lifetime of reckoning that follows. The next morning, he helps me to the shed. We pry up the floorboard together, and I hand him the tin box. "This is yours now," I say. Inside are the logbook, the carbon copy of the second message, my letters to Mercer, and the brass plaque I never placed in Arkhangelsk. Keep it or burn it. But if you keep it, promise me you'll use it to teach others that communication isn't just about sending messages. It's about having the courage to send the right one. Even when it's hard, he takes the box with both hands, as if it's sacred. "I promise. On Sunday before he leaves, he asks if I'll record one more thing just for him. So I sit at my desk, press record, and speak directly to the boy who once asked if I was a hero. Jamie, I say, I wasn't a hero. But I learned that heroes aren't the only ones who matter. The world is saved not just by the brave, but by those who, after failing, choose to try again, to speak, to remember, to honor. That's the lesson I want you to carry. It's never too late to do the right thing, even if it's 50 years late, even if no one applauds, even if it only changes one heart, yours. I stop the recorder. The room is quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. The same clock that's measured out my silence and my speech, my guilt and my grace. In the weeks that follow, I grow weaker. But I am not afraid. I've made my peace, not with the past, but with my place in it. I'm not the man who let 300 men die. I am the man who finally bore witness to their lives. And in that bearing, I found a kind of redemption. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Margaret reads me letters from schools where Jamie has shared my story. A teacher in Glasgow writes that her students now visit the memorial to James MacLeod every year. A boy in Murmansk sends a drawing of the Arctic Convoy Memorial with the words, "Thank you for remembering us." I close my eyes and imagine the sea, not as it was in 1942, but as it is now. Calm, vast, holding the past not as a wound, but as a current that shapes the shore. I did not pull the trigger, but my fingers did fail, and in that failure I learned the weight of a single choice. But I also learned this. Truth, when spoken, becomes a lifeline, not just for the dead, but for the living. And so, as I prepare to send my final transmission, not over radio waves, but into the quiet space between generations, I offer this. To those who died alone in the Arctic cold, I hear you. To those who grieved in silence, I see you. To those who carry guilt they think is unshakable, you are not beyond grace. And to Jamie, my grandson, my hope, my second chance, speak the truth. Even when your voice shakes, especially then, because the world doesn't need perfect heroes. It needs honest humans. And I am, at last, honestly human. This is Thomas Ellis, telegraph operator, HMS Blackwood, and this is my last transmission.